It's a pleasure to be welcoming you to this State of Democracy lecture series and to be hosting in the series Syracuse City Mayor and Maxwell alum, Stephanie Miner, to deliver her farewell address. I want to welcome all of you here. I want to welcome our Maxwell alums and friends watching the live stream, and I also want to welcome the viewers on Spectrum News. I'm Grant Reher, Director of the Campbell Public Affairs Institute, which coordinates these events. On behalf of Syracuse University, I would like to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, the indigenous people on whose ancestral lands we now sit. Before I introduce the mayor, I want to issue some thanks. First, to the Dean's Office for supporting the series. Our Dean, David Van Slyke, regrets that he's unable to attend, but he did want me to say that he's pleased when Maxwell can host thoughtful public servants from both sides of the aisle, especially when they are alumni of the school. He thanks the mayor for her service to Syracuse and her desire to leave what she found better and more beautiful. For technical support, I want to thank the Information and Computing Technology Group, and in particular, Tom Fazio. Thanks as well, and as always, to Kelly Coleman and Sunju Raybeck, who work in the Campbell Institute and help to put these events together. And we have a great group of Maxwell graduate students who are helping us out today. I have a few reminders. First, if you haven't already done so, please silence your smartphones. Second, when we get to the audience Q&A portion of the program that will occur after the mayor has given her remarks, please wait for me to recognize you when you raise your hand, and wait for the microphone to be passed to you so that we can all hear you and that you are part of the live stream. And then finally, perhaps most important, give the microphone back when you're done asking your question. And then just to remind you that following the talk, we'll have a reception out in the foyer where there will be refreshments and we can continue the conversation that we begin here. Now to the mayor. Those of you who regularly come to these events may remember that I'm a big believer in very short introductions. And even though the mayor doesn't really need an introduction at all, this is a challenge for me because there are lots of things that I'd like to say today. But like our speaker, I'm going to stick to my core principles, and so I will be brief. There are just three things I'd like to say to the mayor. The first is simply thank you. Thank you for your service to the city and to this region. And thanks for agreeing to deliver a farewell address in this series. It's nice to have you come back home to Maxwell in order to do that. And I should add that the two people who made that undergraduate degree possible are here with us today, the mayor's parents, Edward and Diane Miner. The second thing I want to say is a little bit more personal. I teach an internship-based course, and I organize a lot of the internships for the political science department here in the school. And Mayor, from the very start, your office has been great about accommodating the interns and giving them significant experiences when they show up. And I want to thank you and Alexander Marion and the rest of your staff for that and for those experiences. And finally, the last thing I want to say is we're proud of you here. We're proud of your trailblazing as a woman in public office, and we're proud of your political courage. I think you did indeed meet the test of the Athenian oath inscribed out in the foyer, in which our dean alluded to. So, well done, Madam Mayor, and the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all of you for being here today. I want to thank Grant for the invitation. Although, in complete candor, when he invited me, he said, I want you to give a speech, but I don't want it to be a State of the City speech. And I said, Grant, I'm kind of fond of those speeches. I think they're pretty good. He said, no, I don't want you to do a State of the City speech. So I want to thank Grant for telling me what he wanted me to do and comparing it to what he didn't want me to do. But most of all, I want to thank the people of the City of Syracuse for giving me the privilege of a lifetime. It is a privilege that I have endeavored to honor every single day. And I think that sense of honor was started right here in this very room. In the fall of 1988, I sat right there where now Joe Gorsuch, who's on my staff, sits. And coming back here, 29 years later, is a real sense of symmetry. Although back then I would have called it a sense of synchronicity. Those of you who were alive in the 80s will know exactly what that reference is about. I had no idea when I sat in that seat that one day I would be mayor of the city of Syracuse. But in November of 2009, my life changed in ways that I could never have imagined, and in ways that I am supremely grateful for. But what changed immediately was that I lost my first name. My name, Stephanie, disappeared, and I became mayor. Now, the first couple of times that happened to me, I would look behind me to see if any of my predecessors were around, and I would realize that people in Syracuse were talking to me. Now, to be fair, when I left Syracuse, I was often not the only person who had a hard time with the vision of me as mayor. In January of 2010, while attending Governor Patterson's State of the State address, at that time, Governor Patterson provided me and the other mayors with a state police escort. Now, today when I go to the Capitol, I have to have a state police escort for different reasons. But that's the subject of another discussion. The state police escort, who happened to be a woman, guided me into the Capitol along with some people who were with me, and she said to the security guards, "Could you please clear the way? I have the mayor of Syracuse with me." And the security guards dutifully cleared the way, and then they looked at Patrick Mannion. Patrick, would you please stand up for us? They looked at Patrick Mannion, who is clearly the physical visitation of what a mayor of the city of Syracuse should look like, and they said, "Go ahead, sir." And everyone was aghast, and I looked at the state trooper, and she said to me, "Don't worry, they'll get used to you soon enough." Now, I'm not sure if they have gotten used to me or not, but nevertheless, there were times, and they continue to be when I leave Syracuse, that people have a hard time saying, "You're the mayor?" Where they don't have a hard time and have never had a hard time is here in the city of Syracuse. A few months after that State of the State address, I was at a kindergarten in Blodgett Elementary School. And I was talking about being mayor and what the mayor did. And this very studious young boy raised his hand. And I could tell he had a burning question, like only a 5-year-old you can read on a 5-year-old's face. And I pointed to him and I said, "Yes." And he said, "Can boys be mayors too?" And I said, "Yes, boys can be mayors." No, in Syracuse, I immediately became the mayor. And the respect of using the title went along with the expectation that I would try to solve people's problems. And it didn't matter what the problem was: overabundance of deer, shortage of primary care physicians, income inequality. If it impacted their lives, and everything impacts my constituents' lives, they expected me to deal with it. So there's a fundamental question you have to answer when that comes at you. At least I had to answer. And that was, how are you going to deal with it when everybody expects you to address their problems? Now, with the little problems, negotiations and management and different sort of conflicts, institutional conflicts, my line was always to the person in front of me: "I got 99 problems. It's up to you if you want to be 99 or 100. And while I said that to him, in my mind, I would hum to myself, "If you're having girl problems, I feel bad for you, son. I got 99 problems. I'm not going to finish the line." It made me chuckle. For those of you who don't know what the next line is, turn to somebody who's under 30 and they will tell you. But the big problems, where leadership matters: poverty, violence, justice. And 95 of the 99 problems that I had were rooted in those. How do you navigate those problems? One of the first problems that I confronted immediately was gun violence. That first summer of my administration was a bloody summer. And what seemed like every Sunday night, I would receive a notification from Chief Fowler about a murder that was more senseless than you can even imagine, and inevitably it was 2 young black men. And these private notifications were followed by weeks of public cries: take people's guns away, give people more guns, do a gun buyback program. All of them often well-meaning people, self-declared experts, giving these neat, simple solutions to really complex problems. And they would die down until the next murder, and it would start all over again. So I did what I was taught to do in this very room. I read, and I researched, and I read. And I found that none of those hot take solutions worked. And yet what felt like it was every Sunday night, I would receive a notification call from Chief Fowler. And I was racked with feelings of desperation and with failure. Right after Thanksgiving of that year, on November 28th, 2010, at around 5 o'clock, my phone rang. And it was Chief Fowler to give me a notification that a 20-month-old child, Rashad Walker Jr., had been shot to death in his car seat. He was an innocent victim of gang violence. The shooter had been looking for the toddler's father. It was the lowest point of my administration. I went to the funeral, and I stood in line in this hot, packed church with the grief so intense you could feel it. And I leaned down to offer my condolences to the toddler's father, who was 19 years old. And I looked at him, and I realized that he was the only person in that church, in our city, and in fact, the whole community, who had no idea what he had lost. Weeks later, as if it was some cosmic affirmation of my feelings about it, a reporter asked him, "What would you have said to the man who killed your son?" And he said, "You missed." But at that moment, when I looked at him, I realized I had a choice. I could relegate this violent experience as an aberration and say that it was other people, that it was not my city, that it was not my neighborhood, that it was not my community. Distinguish myself. And let's be honest, that's the easiest choice in the world to make. Because it's not easy to admit that in your community, a 20-month-old can die a violent death. But it happens. It happens in our city and in communities across this country. And there are lots of people who don't have the luxury of escaping that reality. So at that moment, I decided to accept it and not to distinguish it, to say this was mine. These were my people and my family and my community and my city. And when I did that, I understood that in order to solve a problem, you have to understand it. And in order to understand it, you have to find your shared humanity. And you only do that through reflection and introspection, not by distinguishing yourselves. So here's what I learned. There is a thin line between victim and assailant in youth gun violence. And in fact, Rashad Walker Sr., who is in prison right now for murder, a couple of days before that murder, he shot a young man holding a baby. That to stop such senseless violence, you need the entire community to get involved. Coaches, teachers, neighbors, leaders. That to ask the police alone to solve it is an exercise in futility. And that the places where people have been successful in mitigating gun violence, they have done it by building relationships over time, not by one-offs. And so we went to the community and we formed Cuse Cares, an umbrella organization that oversees several programs from Syracuse Truce to Save Our Youth to Cure Violence. Sharon Owens is here, who's been in the middle of all of them. We used evidence and deterrence to interrupt the violence and to ask and involve whole sections of our community. With our goal being, as others have written, to tackle the hardest cases with a combination of empathy and resolve, offering assistance if it will be accepted, but accountability for brutal behavior. Now, gun violence is still horrific. You don't solve community problems, deep-seated community problems overnight. They're not one-offs. You need to look at it as an investment. But unfortunately, in the times that we live in, the types of programs that are funded are often funded on a budget cycle and are often stopped because it's politically advantageous to spin a situation to a partisan advantage. And to give a hot take, to have a press conference declaring victory through an ideological view and ignoring all evidence to the contrary. Now, gun violence is not Syracuse's problem alone. We know that. No, we in Syracuse are not separate and apart from our nation's troubles. During my tenure, Michael Brown and Eric Gardner and Freddie Gray's deaths illuminated long simmering problems in our country. And Syracuse was one of the few places that had escaped these conflagrations that were ripping through other cities. And I had believed it was because we had meaningfully worked on community bonds, in part by being honest about youth violence. In the wee hours of the morning of June 20th, 2016, I got a call from Chief Fowler. And when I answered, he said to me, "We've got a real problem." And I knew from that moment by his tone and the variation in our normal protocol that we did have a real problem. He went on to explain to me the facts as he knew them at that moment. A dead man, an injured police officer, multiple shots fired, a missing gun, and a neighborhood riot. The next morning, I went straight to the scene, and it was filled with people, investigators collecting evidence, the housing authority collecting refuse from the chaos that had been the night before, people replacing bullet-riddled windows. I got out of the car and I went over to an older woman who was sitting on her stoop. She looked up at me and she said, "Mayor, we got no problems here. Children were having a good time, people were dancing, and the cops rolled up and they started shooting into the crowd." And when she said that to me, I knew two things. The first was that that didn't happen. And the second was that she wasn't lying to me. When I listened to her, I knew that we could not escape the painful history of our country, and we were going to have these discussions as well. It was racing through our country, and it was going to race through us. It's our history as Americans, and thus we all have to be accountable for it. For me, it had been a painful year of news stories. But for her, it had likely been a lifetime of witnessed injustices. And that lifetime of experiences was the prism through which she was going to see this event and the aftermath. Now, the day after such a chaotic event is when the narrative is established. And when there are no clear facts, actually, especially when there are no clear facts, you have a riot and a dead man and a police officer involved, you have a toxic and combustible mix. Everyone's instinct is to jump to conclusions, and social media is on fire with unsubstantiated claims. And indeed, in Syracuse, social media was bubbling with people who had said there had been no gunfire, that the dead man had not been armed, that the police had been unnecessarily and aggressively engaged with a peaceful Father's Day party. And well-intentioned people in the climate we are living in thought it might be true. But while they thought it might be true, they were willing to ask me if it was. And most, after I asked them to withhold judgment until all the facts were gathered, did. They listened, but they also asked me to listen to them. And here's what I told and showed them. On Father's Day 2016, just after 11 p.m., a call came for a man down on Otisco Street. When the officer arrived, she could find no man, but found a crowd of between 300 and 400 people. While waiting for backup to help her disperse the crowd, she heard numerous gunshots, causing her to run towards the shots fired. As she was running, she observed 3 men firing handguns and ordered them to drop their weapons. When they refused, she fired her weapon. When she stopped to clear her jammed weapon, she saw another man within feet of her firing a handgun, and according to multiple witnesses, repeatedly ordered him to drop his weapon. He refused, and she pursued him as he turned his body in her direction, and she shot him in the upper back, which ultimately killed him. Several witnesses identified a man who lived nearby and was known to have felony and weapons convictions pick up the dead man's gun. After the police officer shot her weapon, she was immediately attacked by a mob. She was beaten, groped, and the crowd attempted to rip her uniform off and take her firearm until other officers rescued her. The investigation recovered a total of 37 shell casings, and at least 4 to 5 semi-automatic firearms were discharged at least 30 times. Witness statements identified the man who picked up the gun and his criminal history as the catalyst for a high-risk search warrant procedure involving riot gear and the Bearcat, and to this day, the gun is still missing. And while I showed that and asked and told people about that, here's what they said to me. They were frustrated and fearful about how our culture values the lives of Black people. When a mother tells you that she is worried about her 4-year-old son's life because of the state of our country, you cannot ignore it. And indeed, when 2 mothers, young women, at a meeting at St. Lucy's Rectory, told me of their worries, it was like hearing a primal scream. A scream for justice and a scream for people to recognize injustice. And it didn't matter that the primal injustice was not the Father's Day event. It was the emotional opening for them, and I think they hoped for us. Now, in light of, or because of the Father's Day event, there were a number of people who self-identified as Black Lives Matter. And it was a very tenuous time because there had been a march in Dallas where a police officer had been shot. The Black Lives Matter folks said to me that they wanted to march, and we worked with the local organizers to ensure that they could exercise their guaranteed First Amendment rights and to have the opportunity to peacefully present their grievances. On our part, that meant being very conscious of our police presence. We did not want this.
Platoon! Shield! Down! Platoon!
that we wanted to show people that we believed that they could exercise their grievances according to their constitutional rights. And it meant going on City Hall steps and talking to marchers when they asked, and staying inside when they didn't. Within hours of the start of the first march, and there were 3, a story appeared about downtown businesses closing because of fears of the march. I immediately started making phone calls to try to trace who was doing this. I eventually traced it back to the management of the federal building. And when pressed, the sanitized explanation was that they didn't want people's cars to get stuck in traffic due to the march. By the way, they have never done that for any of the huge festivals downtown. This was a first, and it was garbage. They had made a snap judgment without talking to anyone that the march was dangerous. The irony, of course, is that the very building that houses the government created by the Constitution closes when Americans say they're going to exercise that right guaranteed in that document. But more to the point, what does it communicate to those mothers who are worried that the country does not value the lives of their sons? There's an interesting paradox in cities. It's a modern construct where you take a whole bunch of strangers, often ostracized, gays, immigrants, poor people, and you push them all together and you say, figure it out. And that process of figuring it out is an essential element of democracy. Because you see, proximity brings conflict. Sometimes the conflict is small, like barking dogs. Sometimes the conflict is large, like the meaning of equal justice under the law. But in our modern society, when Facebook, Twitter, and anonymous comments are vehicles to vent without an opportunity to think, without an opportunity for reflection, it separates us. You make a judgment on face value, and you put it on social media, and you're done. But what does it do to our ability to solve problems if we don't listen to each other? What does it do if we won't even take the time to reflect and to find the facts out before we take a position? If we are so busy to get to that judgment, the hot take, without examining all the facts, then how will we ever find justice or equity if we won't even stop to listen to each other? Now, equity is an easy word to say, yet it is very hard to actualize. 79% of the students in the Syracuse City School District are economically disadvantaged. But what does that mean? Those of us who don't live it, I think, often romanticize it. Sayings like, well, you know, my family was poor, but we didn't know it. Or we didn't have much, but we got by and we worked hard. Let me tell you what it means in Syracuse. In Syracuse, it means you rent a 2-bedroom apartment for you and your 2 children, and your apartment is not the greatest. The paint is chipping on the walls and your kitchen faucet isn't working. But it's a roof over your head and not a shelter. You don't have the money to take care of chipping paint in your apartment, so your children are at risk of lead poisoning. You didn't graduate from high school and are currently struggling to obtain your GED and finish a job training program. Looking for work is hard. Not having a high school degree immediately eliminates you from jobs, and even with a GED, you will struggle in our new economy. You rely on social services to help support your family. And you hear the message over and over again that if you work, you will lose some or possibly all of your benefits. Your youngest, still too small to attend school, stays with your mom because a certified child care program is too expensive. Your part-time job has constantly changing shifts, so when you're gone in the morning, your oldest has to take his brother to your mom's house before heading to school. This often makes him late, which has started to get him into trouble with his teacher and is impacting his grades. He is struggling with schoolwork and he is frustrated and gets into a lot of fights, often ending in detention or worse, suspended. This means he is home alone and more likely to get into trouble when you are working. You are worried about paying the rent this month. You've been evicted twice this year. And you don't want to move the kids again. You might have to let the heat bill slide this month and add some extra blankets to the kids' beds. If you do find full-time work at a minimum wage job, you're walking a thin line. Based on the current minimum wage in New York State, you would take home $816 a month. Your rent is $667 a month, not including utilities. This means you are housing cost burden with more than 30% of your income going towards housing costs. You receive an average of $379 a month from SNAP, which helps pay for groceries. When your food money runs low by the end of the month, you buy unhealthy processed food because it will last longer. And if all the money is gone, you have to go to the Samaritan Center for free meals. You can use food pantries too, but that can be complicated as well because each one is open on different days and different hours, and you can only go once a month to each pantry. You have no car, and you have to rely on buses to get around the city. The bus also takes extra time, but you have to take the bus. When you have to take the bus, your work options become even more limited. Buses typically do not run to employment hubs located outside the city at night and during off-peak shift hours. When you are constantly having to move or risk homelessness or go a winter month without heat, you and your family risk physical and psychological trauma. Living in poverty impacts every part of your ability to get out of it. And it's not just here in Syracuse or in upstate New York. If trends continue, 1 out of every 7 students in New York City will be homeless by the time they reach 5th grade. Yet we as a society take these children who live these issues every day and we deposit them at the school and we say, compete with your wealthier suburban counterparts. And we wonder why the results are dramatically different. And yet on that first day of school that I have gone to every year as mayor, and I suspect happened long before I was mayor and long after I was mayor, every single one of the children that I have seen walks into school with different faces and different backgrounds and these challenges, but they all have sparkling new shoes. For parents living this reality, buying new shoes for their children is a statement, and it's a sacrifice of hope about the future. Those shoes have always, to me, been a consecrated sign of the hopes and beliefs that parents have in our school system. A trust that the school will develop and nurture talent. They believe, and I think we all believe, that talent is universal. But opportunity is not. And so why is it, when New York State spends the most per pupil in the United States, that opportunity is not universal? Well, the hot take is clearly that schools are wasting money and that the teachers are incompetent. And the hot take on the other side is that, oh, we're just fighting and fighting to get more money and get more money. But if you look deeper at the data, you will discover that New York State has the most racially segregated schools in the United States. And racial and poverty segregation create educational challenges related directly to unequal opportunity. Studies show that when students are socialized in schools in which few students have benefited from the advantages and power that middle-class families possess and exercise on behalf of their children, they are poorly prepared for institutions of higher learning and good jobs, which are largely white middle-class institutions. The informal contacts that children get in suburban schools develop into better opportunity and better information, and that also remains segregated. So thus, this segregation perpetuates racial and economic inequality. Now, New York State has long had a practice of maintaining its school aid for every district, no matter how much each district spends. And the state doesn't want to reduce foundation aid for any district, regardless of its actual need or changing demographics or decreasing enrollment. The greatest need, of course, is in poor districts, but wealthy districts are stronger politically. And as a result, wealthy districts, often largely white, keep getting more and more, and poor districts, largely children of color, can never catch up. So simply adding money to the foundation aid doesn't address the fundamental flaws in the current distribution formula. And so given this data, the Syracuse versus Jamesville, DeWitt, Skaneateles graduation chart makes a lot more sense. Now we know, of course, that our children face huge challenges and barriers due to grinding poverty. And while I will continue to argue for the state to meet its long-delayed court-ordered responsibilities to adequately fund our school district, the other thing that we did that was much more effective was we used our partnership with Say Yes to Education and Onondaga County to make sure that we could develop a model whereby we enticed families to stay engaged in the educational system by promising free college tuition. But most important, we used our resources to put various types of support in schools for students and their families to enhance opportunities for academic achievement, from legal and health services to mental health support to after-school programs, to try and mitigate some of the factors that I read to you earlier. And I believe that this has helped increase our graduation rate, far from our goal, but the highest it's been in 10 years. And because of Say Yes to Education, more than 2,900 Syracuse students have gone to college, most of whom would not have been able to go to college without the Say Yes promise. Now, New York State is often not a productive partner in this effort to meet these challenges. Grant Middle School, one of our middle schools, was deemed persistently struggling by the state and given 1 year to improve or to have a receiver appointed. Now, appointing a receiver is an act that has very rarely, if ever, led to better academic achievement. But the administration and the teachers got to work and they devised a plan. Start the day earlier, have the day go longer, personalize the curriculum for every student, use real-time data, restorative discipline, not suspension. Now, of course, there were costs associated with all of these actions, but the state had given extra money to help address persistently struggling schools. And lo and behold, Grant showed drastic improvements on the state exams and was no longer threatened with receivership. And New York State responded by taking away the funding for the programs that had helped get them off of receivership. Now, the parents were ultimately forced to sue, and ultimately they won, and the funding was restored. Now, the ultimate goal, of course, of our education system is to create productive members of our community. And that's a code word for employees. But people need jobs in order to be employees. And jobs, economic development, is the holy grail of Syracuse. And I think that's because it's in our institutional and psychological memories. Because Syracuse was once one of the 30 largest, wealthiest cities in the United States. Higher incomes, better education, higher standards. Jobs with employers like General Electric, Syracuse at China, and of course, Carrier. In 1921, Syracuse was described this way: we manufacture more typewriters than any other city in the world, more soda products than any other city in the world, more auto parts and gears than any city in the world. Last vacation, I was on an old farm in Maine, and standing in the corner was a Syracuse plow. Hanging next to it was a Dietz lantern made in Syracuse. And clearly, that is far from where we are now. And in fact, all 12 of New York State's metropolitan statistical areas had economic growth rates below the national average in 2016. And data indicates that if Upstate were its own state, our job growth would rank 4th worst in the nation, below, among others, Mississippi. And 88% of the net jobs that came to Upstate New York during the last 8 years have been in low-wage sectors, led by restaurants and bars. Now, to change this trend, the focus has been on altering governmental policies, reducing tax burdens, spending money on large economic development projects, specifically focusing on providing efforts to promote regional growth. And of course, these come along with the big exciting announcements and the ribbon cuttings and the job creation announcements. But it's not working. So why is it not working? Well, upstate New York metropolitan areas are distinctive for the amount of economic segregation that exists between cities and suburban areas. Upstate cities have higher percentages of poor people than the Rust Belt average, and regional strategies that do not focus on the needs of upstate cities who have been hit hardest by the growth of poverty over the last decade. You see, because cities are home to people who compete least effectively for jobs. Poor educational attainment, criminal records, transportation difficulties. For these reasons, traditional economic development or tax incentive strategies are unlikely to benefit them. And instead, strategies that directly address obstacles that prevent city residents from getting good full-time jobs would be more likely to mitigate poverty. So if the economic strategy is not creating jobs, and it's leaving behind huge swaths of people, then why are we still doing it? Well, the answer is because even failed policies benefit some people. And who do these policies benefit? Politicians and campaign contributors. These big, exciting announcements I mentioned earlier, the ceremonial shoveling, the ribbon cuttings, followed by the ubiquitous huge job creation numbers, they become the omnipresent campaign mailers and TV commercials. Propaganda by any other name. Propaganda aimed at you to communicate, I care about jobs. But the data shows that they're really benefiting campaign contributors, or so-called vested interests. Together, the campaign contributors and the politicians form this virtually impregnable alliance where they direct public resources towards the contributors' projects, regardless of the project's merit. Now, most of us who are not undergraduate students here remember Destiny. Nothing like it in the world. Which was actually true if you considered the preposterous claims about the project. On October 24th of 2002, the Pyramid Group held a groundbreaking for the Grand Destiny Hotel. The ceremony was billed as the start on a construction of a 47-story, 1,300-room, $180 million hotel. And the event attracted 3,000 people, including politicians who could and did play a role in getting government incentives. It all seemed so surreal because it was. A couple of years later, in litigation papers, the former Destiny CEO admitted there was never an intention to build anything. When asked why the ceremony was held, the CEO referenced the governor's campaign and re-election and said, quote, "The intent was to show that what we wanted to do, as opposed to actually doing something." The Grand Destiny was never built. Nothing like it in the world became a typical mall. The good jobs and record-breaking sales tax revenue never materialized. But Destiny received governmental subsidies totaling $600 million. And politicians received thousands of dollars in campaign contributions. And the cycle of contributions followed by giveaways continues to this day, as does the list of failed economic development projects. But the Destiny Project did something else. It took this short girl in an oversized black suit and it made her an advocate. It made me understand that we Syracusans are a hardy people, often born into adversity, but refusing to use that as an excuse to accept second best. Like that 5-year-old who asked me if boys can be mayor, he did something that we Syracusans all do. We dream of a future that looks different, but includes us. The people of Syracuse, not the campaign contributors or the recipients, but the people who buy new shoes for their children on the first day of school. The people who see our boys not thugs when they want to end gun violence. The people who understand that justice is seen through a prism of many different lights. The people who experience tragedy and triumph with grace and dignity, those people. Those people asked for and wanted and voted for a fighter, because that's who they are. People who struggle to fight adversity and through those struggles hold on to their aspirations for themselves and for each other. Now, our struggles as a community to solve challenges, to constructively answer how we together can move forward, demands the reflection to get effective solutions. If we relegate ourselves to our culture's rush to judgment, to take things at face value, to decide a position after reading 140 characters, to condone the metaphorical and often literal screaming at each other, then we almost ensure we will not be able to make progress. I have thought a great deal about this as I move closer to reclaiming my first name and relinquishing my title. And while our issues seemed to be caused by the rapid change inherent to our modernity, I have been reminded that they are not. And in fact, they are as old as our country itself. In arguing for the adoption of our Constitution, Alexander Hamilton, a good New Yorker, and somebody who's being recognized more and more, wrote in Federalist No. 1, "It has been frequently remarked that it seems to have been reserved to the people of this country by their conduct and example to decide the important question, whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force." If there be any truth in the remark, the crisis at which we are arrived may with propriety be regarded as the era in which that decision is to be made. He wrote this in 1787. Now, some 230 years later, we face our own crisis of reflection. And it is up to us, as Syracusans, as New Yorkers, and as Americans, to once again take Hamilton's words to heart and to demonstrate that we are capable of establishing good government from reflection and choice. It is my plan to do that on January 1st, 2018, as Stephanie Miner, just as I have endeavored to do that since January 1st, 2010, as Mayor Miner. Thank you, Syracuse.
So I think the audience just gave you an A. Thank you very much, Mayor, for that speech. That was really quite something. We do have time now for a healthy amount of time for questions. And again, what I would remind you is I'd like to try to call on people 2 at a time. If you'd like to ask a question to the mayor, please raise your hand. I'll recognize you, and then we will get the microphone to you. So. Where I'm not seeing. Oh, okay. Tom there. We'll get Tom, and then who else? Tom, I guess you're the only one right now. Go ahead.
I can ask 2 questions.
Good one, Tom.
Thanks so much, Mayor Minor. So sitting here listening to your speech, and I feel like I could ask a question as a Hamilton fan. I could ask a question as a political science professor here at Maxwell. I could ask a question as a member of CNY Solidarity Coalition. But I think what I want to do is ask a question as a parent of 2 kids at Smith K through 8. And I just wonder if you could say, I really appreciate what you had to say about the schools, and I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about what it is that somebody in the governor's mansion could do concretely in the coming couple years to improve the schools in Syracuse and in other poor districts throughout the state. Thanks.
So let me say this, that the Syracuse City School District offers a tremendous education to the children who are in it. And the diversity of programming, the diversity of experience is exceptional. The issue that we as New Yorkers have to come to terms with is that children who live in poverty have greater needs than children who don't. And because of the way, it's really because of how we fund primarily, we started funding systems by jurisdictions. And so when you're doing it by property tax base, then you often have this concentration of poverty. I think the first thing that has to happen is that there has to be, when the answer comes back, we spend more per pupil than any other state in the country, all of us have to say that's not acceptable to just give us a bullet answer. Because the second part is, if you live in Westchester or Long Island, or God bless you in Skinny Atlas, you're doing really well, and your kids probably have the option of getting Mandarin. But if your children are in the city school district, or some of your neighbors' children are in the city school district, they're worried about where their next meal is coming from, where they're going to put their head on the pillow that night. So I would answer back to you, Tom, that we as citizens have to accept the responsibility to have a more engaged dialogue with our elected officials. That to accept sound bites and television commercials and propaganda is not acceptable. And if we are unhappy with the results of economic development, with the results of an unequal justice system, with the results of a racially segregated school system, then you have to let your elected officials know that, and that you also have to let them know that you will not accept the standard answer back from them. Like, I fought for more foundation aid on the one hand, or on the other hand, we spend more than any other, or the teachers are incompetent. And what my message, what I tried to do with this address is to say to all of you, from a very personal perspective as mayor, how that conflict between the superficial, neat, easy answer and these really thorny, complicated societal issues collide. And the best of us want to just life is complicated and there are a lot of problems. So give me give me the Twitter answer. But we can't, because too many people are being left behind. And our society depends on us being educated and active citizens of a democracy.
I like Tom, but I want to have someone else ask another question before he asks the second one. Here we go, this woman here.
Thanks for doing this.
Thank you.
Give us something you're happiest about and tell us where you'd like to have a do-over.
So I am I'll tell you two things that I am happiest about. The first is that I have found it to be a blessing and a privilege to go to work every single day. The people that I work with, many of whom are interspersed around here, are just an extraordinary collection of talent. And the ability to thoughtfully address public policy with that group of people has been a profound honor. And I will miss that. The second part that I will miss is that the people that I represent have been so incredibly gracious and warm and welcoming. And I'm going to tell you a little off-color story. If any of you are offended by bad language, now's the time to put earmuffs on. I have a good friend of mine, Libby Schaff, who's the mayor of Oakland, California. We were talking one day about being mayor, and she has a daughter who's 8 years old. And we're talking about the trials and tribulations of never being a stranger in your city, always being responsible. And she said to me, I was riding a bike with my daughter, and this guy came by on a bike and said, "Hey, Libby Schaff, fuck you." And she said, "There's my 8-year-old daughter, you know how that happens, right, Stephanie?" And I was like, "Nope." Nope. That would never happen to me, to my face. Now, I'm sure it happens behind my back all the time, and I'm fine with that. But the people of this city have, and there's a lot of people who say, "Oh, I don't know how you can do what you do. Oh my God." The part of it that they don't realize, or that you don't realize, is that the incredible generosity of people in this community. They open up their homes to you, their lives to you, and they want you to be a part of their life. And they do it in the most pure ways. I'll give you just another example, because these are the ones I've been getting a lot of what I call participation trophies. I go and people are like, "Hey, great, here, you were here 8 years and you didn't get indicted. Good for you." But what is today, when I walked out of City Hall to get something to eat, and I often do that by myself, when I walk through the city, everywhere I go, people are like, "Hi, Mayor. Hey, how are you, Mayor?" And since about after Labor Day, every single person has said to me, "We will miss you. Thank you. We're happy you were here, and you were special to us." I went out to dinner with my husband a couple of months ago, and no shocker to those of you who know me, I had a beer with dinner. And I had beer and I had a salad, and this was at Riley's. And my husband didn't have anything to drink, and so the waitress comes with a bill, and she says, "You'll notice that the beer is not on your bill." She said, "That's my thank you to you for all that you've done for me." Doesn't get any better than that. Doesn't get any better than that. So the do-overs, look, when you make 150 decisions a day, every day, 7 days a week for 8 years, you're going to make some bad ones. I have tried not to focus on the bad ones because you want to get up every day and start over again. I approached this job, and when I was on the city council, I had the same philosophy, which is you're not going to agree with me always. We know that. You're not going to agree with me always, but you will always understand the reasons for the positions that I took. For me, that was the only way that I could exist as an elected official taking positions, and particularly in the mayor's office. And I found that has really worked for me, because people will say to me, "I don't like your position on this, but I respect you and I understand it." So I was not somebody who ran for office to be loved. I was somebody who wanted to be respected. And I feel like I accomplished that. Bad decisions and all.
I'm here, and I'll call on the second person now, the gentleman in the tie there, right down in front of you, Sanjeev. Yeah. We'll go to Sarah first.
Thank you, Mayor. You seem to suggest in your speech that government can and should work to make people's lives better. There's an important role for government. I feel like the Democrats in general, though, are not making that case or have not made that case very well over the last several decades, and that might be one reason why we're in the situation we are today. Do you have any suggestions for how to change the narrative about government?
Well, I think that my first suggestion is to all of us to hold everybody accountable for that, and to not be bought off with cotton candy when what we really need are real answers. And I would tell you that I think you're right, that the Democratic Party has struggled with that, but where Democrats have not struggled is mayors. And what you're seeing, so, you know, for the first time in the history of the planet, there are more people living in cities than outside of cities. And mayors tend to be, by our Constitution, pretty laid-back, flexible people, because you got to be ready. You're in the grocery store, they're going to hit you with, you know, we want you to castrate deers, or, you know, they're going to talk to you about how their trash was picked up. So if you don't like people, or you're, you know, you have big boundary issues, that's not the job for you. But every mayor that I have ever met has always wanted to make people's lives better. And I think that the fact that we're doing it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every day, every week, people across this country are responding to that. So what you're seeing is the Democratic Party looking to mayors and saying, we want you to stand up and be the voice of our party.
Mayor Minor,
Gentleman here.
is this on? I don't know if I could hear it.
Yeah,
Oh, there we
I
go. Thank you so much for being here. As I'm an undergraduate student, my name is David Edelstein from a town in New Jersey called Paramus. So I think it's very cool that the mayor of the big city of Syracuse comes to the university to speak, and it gives me the opportunity to come here and hear from you as well as ask a question. I studied journalism, and one story I was doing this past week was about the voter registration deadlines. The first question I asked people was, one, do you want to vote? And a lot of them answered, yes, I want to be politically active, and I want to know what's going on, and I think that voices are important to be heard. And then the second question I asked them was, did you know that the voter registration deadline has passed? Have you registered to vote? And the answer was, no, I haven't registered to vote, which would mean that they're not going to be able to. So my question for you, something that I've been thinking about, is in this society, whether you're an undergraduate student like myself or an employee, an adult in the world, how do we get people to be politically active and do democracy, speak to each other, and take the time to actually understand opinions and be active in that?
So let me say that a corollary to my discussion about economic development is that it is very difficult in New York State to vote. And it's very difficult in New York State to vote by design, because the politicians who get these campaign contributions want to choose their voters. So they want to make it as difficult as possible so that pool of voters is really, really small, so that they can then send them 10, 15 mailings and be like, I've got jobs, here I am with this golden shovel, here I am with this projection. In Oregon, they have vote by mail. Their voter turnout is often 80%. Vote by mail, 80%. Imagine how different our public policy would be here in New York State if it were easy to vote, if you could do that. And there's no reason we can't have that. We call ourselves the progressive state, the Excelsior state, largely based on a track record from the 20s when FDR was governor. And it is time for us to say, no, it shouldn't be difficult to vote, and we should not have politicians choosing voters, and we should make it easier to do that so that it is easier for people to engage in the process and demand better government. And once that happens, once people feel like, yeah, my vote matters, or I'm going to be involved in the process. And again, so when people say, oh, I'm going to make it, I'm a progressive, I'm going to make it easier to vote because I'm going to extend voter registration by a month. That's garbage. Say, make it easier to vote. Do you know how one of the biggest issues if you're poor is your mobility? You're moving all the time. Well, how are you going to vote if your vote is based on where you live? when, when you register to vote, you live there, and that was like 6 places ago. Well, that's the government telling poor people, we don't care. And as I said, the number of poor people in our country are growing and growing, and in our state are growing and growing. We have to, and I'm going to keep going back because you're going to say, man, she sounds like a broken record. Hold people accountable and don't allow Twitter, Facebook, television commercials to be the argument that wins the day.
Take these two folks right here on either side of that aisle.
You mentioned earlier the importance of having an open and honest dialogue and not falling for like hot take like comments or solutions, and not falling. What steps in particular do you think ought to be taken to make that possible?
So I would tell you that Mike Bloomberg said to me before I was mayor, trust in God, for everyone else bring data. And so part of what you have to say to people is, show me the data behind your idea. And that's a way to separate the wheat from the chaff. But it's even more fundamental than that. It's listening. And look, sometimes it's uncomfortable to listen to people. Sometimes, and I've had it myself, where, I have people who I am friendly with, who are public servants, who are Trump supporters. And that to me is difficult. But you know what makes it easier? When I sit across a table and I listen to them and I realize they want the best things for their constituents, just like I want the best things for my constituents. And that we try to, if the more we talk and the more we listen to each other, the better it's going to be.
Go ahead.
Thanks. Hi, Mayor. Thank you so much for your talk. I noticed that you ended with a picture of the that event at the airport where you talked about the sanctuary city, and I wanted to thank you for that. I know that I have walked taller in my city for knowing that you declared it a sanctuary city, and not just that, but that there was so much support from the whole city for that. Shortly after that, though, we got the news about the high level of homelessness among the children in our schools, and I just wonder if you can think of a way to extend that outpouring of love for immigrants that came when you made that declaration. How can we extend that kind of sense of sanctuary to the kids who were born here and are living with those kinds of difficulties?
Well, we're trying to do it every single day and have been for 8 years in my administration. We have built, and Paul Driscoll is here with his leadership, and Sharon Owens and others in neighborhood and business development. We have built we have, in partnership, had built thousands of units of affordable housing. And we work very hard with the school district to make sure that we keep people in housing. And we work very hard with our shelter organization to try to minimize our homeless population. And in fact, we have a functional zero for homelessness among veterans. But those are, I feel like the problem really is that the federal government turned its back on cities in an urban policy, and the state government, in effect, has done that as well. And we in cities are scrambling to do these ad hoc solutions over and over and over again. And we do it reasonably well, but it's still ad hoc. And so in order to make sure that children have a safe and healthy environment, well, you can't cut lead funding. You can't cut remediation of lead funding. You have to be able to provide affordable housing, and it's an issue in every single city. By the way, across the world, Tel Aviv has a huge issue with affordable housing. New York City has a crisis. Washington, D.C. is, we do well. It's a different kind of crisis. But we need federal and state policy that looks at these systematic issues. Now, let me say something, too, about sanctuary city status. I was very honored to do that for both personal and professional reasons. The personal reasons are that my family are immigrants, and came to Syracuse. And so personally, it felt really special to me to be at a time and place when it mattered and my views on that mattered. Professionally, though, I have to tell you that there was no blowback for me at all. Like, I was shocked. I thought, okay, I'm going to get ready, and everywhere I went, people thanked me. Everywhere I went, and cards and emails. It seemed like a no-brainer, and at the time, I thought it was a no-brainer. A couple of weeks ago, I read Underground Railroad by Colson, Whitehead, and if any of you have not read that book, you should go out today and read that book. It's breathtaking. In the book, the slave catcher is trying to find the escaped slaves, and he says he goes and picks up and looks for newspapers in free cities, emancipated cities. Syracuse is one of those cities. And then I started looking a little bit more because I've become obsessed with this book. And the king of the Underground Railroad was Jermaine Logan, who would advertise in the newspaper that if you were a fugitive slave looking for safety, you could come to his house. This is when it was illegal in the country. The mayor of the city of Syracuse sent a letter to the railroad and said to the railroad, you will not be allowed to come into the city of Syracuse and in front of City Hall if your train is delivering fugitive slaves back south. I say this to say to all of us that this is a proud history that we have of being a place for justice and for progress and for opportunity. And while it seems at times a very dark time in our country, that I think gives each of us an opportunity to be lights and to say this is who our history is and this is what we believe in a time that it matters.
Take two final questions. We'll get Diana there and anybody from this side here? Mark over here.
Mayor, you mentioned opportunities, and there is so much work to do. Do you have any idea what's next for Stephanie Miner?
NYU, and I'm not being coy. By the way, it's not my reputation to be coy. You all know that. I'm a pretty direct person. I don't. Part of the reason I don't know is because I have loved this job. And not every minute, but most days, I have loved this job. And the ability to work with the people that I've worked with, to represent the people that I've represented, and to do the kind of good work that we have done, and to always have a plate full of challenges has just been an extraordinary opportunity, and one that I'm really profoundly grateful for. And any other job seems to me to pale in comparison to it. So, so I'm going to take some time, figure out what it is that's next, and you know, and try to be graceful about a transition that is inherently difficult for me.
Final question here.
Mayor Miner, as you know, I'm a native Syracusan and I love the city. I think there's some great things happening here and there's a tremendous amount of potential. But as you mentioned, there's a lot of people who are not heard, right? And so the people that I talk to, and I don't speak for all black people, but the people that I talk to that are poor and black say when white people want things to happen in this city, it happens. And unless and until they do, it doesn't. So how do we give voice and opportunity to those people who feel unheard and feel like nothing's happening for them, even though they're here and they've been here for a long time?
So I will tell you, you call bullshit. So they're absolutely right. Let me give you an example. The Upstate Revitalization Initiative, $500 million project, cocktail parties about how great it was going to be. And it was sold on the fact that it was going to be a meaningful part of that was going to address the poverty issues and the injustice in the city of Syracuse. And $70 million immediately went to the LED lighting company in DeWitt, right off the bat. And then another $20 million was earmarked for, I think, an exit ramp for the amphitheater. $90 million, like that. What happened? to what happened to justice and working on issues of economic inequality. People have to stand up and say that is wrong. And you have to support other people when they stand up and say that is wrong. That shouldn't have happened. Now, I will also say to you that part of that Upstate Revitalization Initiative money went to close the endowment gap for Say Yes to Education. So of those 2,900 students that went to college, I think most of them are Black children from Syracuse. Of the 21,000 students who are in the city school district who are being helped by the partnership with Onondaga County to provide mental health and legal services and all of that, also needs to be supported. But the cynicism that I think is easy for all of us to engage in allows bad public policy to exist. And I was reading something today that Barbara Jordan said. She said, if there's a bad decision and you don't stand up against it, it will seem as if the majority supports it. So you have to hold people accountable. And I will say it back too. If the minority community says when white people want things to happen, it happens, and when Black people want things to happen, it doesn't, I think that there is truth there. But I also think that the minority community has to say, are you voting and are you participating and are you holding people accountable? Because if injustice is done over and over again, or if bad decisions are made over and over again, let me walk away from some of the stronger language. If bad decisions are made over and over again, and certain constituencies are often on the short end of those decisions, but they do nothing to hold people accountable for that, it's a democracy, everyone. That's the way it works.
So let me just say three things again to the mayor in conclusion. First, Mayor, thank you again for coming here to the Maxwell School to give this speech. Secondly, thanks for not giving a State of the City speech. And then third, thanks also, though, for giving us something that was rich and substantive and worthy for us to reflect on, to use your title, out on the reception, which you're all invited to. So thank you very much.